At the very same time, in 1975, there was a confrontation between two powerful men in Damascus, the capital of Syria. One was Henry Kissinger, the US Secretary of State. The other was the president of Syria, Hafez al-Assad. The battle between the two men was going to have profound consequences for the world. And like in New York, it was going to be a struggle between the old idea of using politics to change the world and a new idea that you could run the world as a stable system. President Assad dominated Syria. The country was full of giant images and statues that glorified him. He was brutal and ruthless, killing or imprisoning anyone he suspected of being a threat. But Assad believed that the violence was for a purpose. He wanted to find a way of uniting the Arab countries and using that power to stand up to the West.
4, 3, 2, 1.
Kissinger was also tough and ruthless. He had started in the 1950s as an expert in the theory of nuclear strategy, what was called the delicate balance of terror. It was the system that ran the Cold War. Both sides believed that if they attacked, the other side would immediately launch their missiles and everyone would be annihilated. Kissinger had been one of the models for the character of Dr. Strangelove in Stanley Kubrick's film.
Mr. President, I would not rule out the chance to preserve a nucleus of human specimens. It would be quite easy. At the bottom of some of our deeper mine shafts.
Henry was not a warm, friendly, modest, jovial sort of person. He was thought of as one of the more anxious, temperamental, self-conscious, ambitious, inconsiderate people at Harvard.
Kissinger saw himself as a hard realist. He had no time for the emotional turmoil of political ideologies. He believed that history had always really been a struggle for power between groups and nations. But what Kissinger took from the Cold War was a way of seeing the world as an interconnected system. And his aim was to keep that system in balance and prevent it from falling into chaos.
I believe that with all the dislocations we now experience, there also exists an extraordinary opportunity to form for the first time in history a truly global society, carried by the principle of interdependence. And if we act wisely and with vision, I think we can look back to all this turmoil as the birth pangs of a more creative and better system. If we miss the opportunity, I think there's going to be chaos.
The flight has been delayed, we understand now. The Kissinger will be arriving here about an hour and a half from now. So we'll just get have the press informed, and then we'll stay in contact with you.
And it was this idea that Kissinger set out to impose on the chaotic politics of the Middle East. But to manage it, he knew that he was going to have to deal with President Assad of Syria. President Assad was convinced that there would only ever be a real and lasting peace between the Arabs and Israel if the Palestinian refugees were allowed to return to their homeland. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were living in exile in Syria, as well as in the Lebanon and Jordan.
Have you found that the Palestinians here want to integrate with the Syrians at all?
Oh, no, never. They don't want, not here or neither in Lebanon or in Jordan, never. No, because they want to stay as a whole, as a Palestinian. They call themselves those who go back, al-Aidun in Arabic.
Assad also believed that such a peace would strengthen the Arab world. But Kissinger thought that strengthening the Arabs would destabilize his balance of power. So he set out to do the very opposite, to fracture the power of the Arab countries by dividing them and breaking their alliances, so they would keep each other in check. Kissinger now played a double game, or as he termed it, constructive ambiguity. In a series of meetings, he persuaded Egypt to sign a separate agreement with Israel. But at the same time, he led Assad to believe that he was working for a wider peace agreement, one that would include the Palestinians. In reality, the Palestinians were ignored. They were irrelevant to the structural balance of the global system.
The hallmark of Kissinger's thinking about international politics is its structural design. Everything is always connected in his mind to everything else. But his first thoughts are on that level, on the structural global balance of power level. And as he addresses questions of human dignity, human survival, human freedom, I think they tend to come into his mind as an adjunct of the play of nations at the power game.
When Assad found out the truth, it was too late. In a series of confrontations with Kissinger in Damascus, Assad raged about this treachery. He told Kissinger that what he had done would release demons hidden under the surface of the Arab world. Kissinger described their meetings. Assad's controlled fury, he wrote, was all the more impressive for its eerily cold, seemingly unemotional demeanor. Assad now retreated. He started to build a giant palace that loomed over Damascus, and his belief that it would be possible to transform the Arab world began to fade. A British journalist who knew Assad wrote, "Assad's optimism has gone. A trust in the future has gone. What has emerged instead is a brutal, vengeful Assad, who believes in nothing except revenge."
Solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
That I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
The new President of America had a new vision of the world. It wasn't the harsh realism of Henry Kissinger any longer. It was different. It was a simple moral crusade, where America had a special destiny to fight evil and to make the world a better place.
The places and the periods in which man has known freedom are few and far between, just scattered moments on the span of time. And most of those moments have been ours. The American people have a genius for great and unselfish deeds. Into the hands of America, God has placed the destiny of an afflicted mankind. God bless America.
But this crusade was going to lead Reagan to come face to face with Henry Kissinger's legacy. And above all, the vengeful fury of President Assad of Syria. Israel was now determined to finally destroy the power of the Palestinians. And in 1982, they sent a massive army to encircle the Palestinian camps in the Lebanon.
Do you know how strong the Israelis are? Do you know how many tanks they have outside Beirut? Do you know how strong they are?
يعني بيقول انه احنا بنعرف انه الاسرائيليين اقوياء، فهل هذا بيأثر علينا؟ إسرائيل وأمريكا وكل دول العالم ما بتأثر علينا طول ما سلاحنا بإيدنا ولا أي دولة في العالم تقدر تحاربنا.
That means we are not ready to surrender.
طول ما هو الشعب رافع راسه والشعب معنا ما حدا بيقدرنا.
طلع شاب يانج لسه بيبل أولاد صغار على الحرب.
Dash into this building here because the PLO guys would expect that sooner or later there will be a huge explosion. There have been several of these in the last few minutes. As you can see, there's enormous damage in all the buildings around here.
Quick.
2 months later, thousands of Palestinian refugees were massacred in the camps. It horrified the world. But what was even more shocking was that Israel had allowed it to happen. Its troops had stood by and watched as a Christian Lebanese faction murdered the Palestinians.
This was the first of the massacres we discovered yesterday. Now, 24 hours later, the stench here is appalling. But the effects on the Israelis of what their Christian allies did here and in dozens of other places around this camp are going to be immense. There's always been a risk of such massacres if Christian militiamen were allowed to come into Palestinian camps, and the Israelis seem to have done nothing to prevent them coming into this one.
In the face of the horror and the growing chaos, President Reagan was forced to act. He announced that American Marines would come to Beirut to lead a peacekeeping force. Reagan insisted that the troops were neutral, but President Assad was convinced that there was another reality. He saw the troops as part of the growing conspiracy between America and Israel to divide the Middle East into factions and destroy the power of the Arabs. Assad decided to get the Americans out of the Middle East. And to do this, he made an alliance with the new revolutionary force of Ayatollah Khomeini's Iran. And what Khomeini could bring to Assad was an extraordinary new weapon that he had just created. It was called the poor man's atomic bomb. Ayatollah Khomeini had come to power 2 years before as the leader of the Iranian Revolution. But his hold on power was precarious. And Khomeini had developed a new idea of how to fight his enemies and defend the revolution. Khomeini told his followers that they could destroy themselves in order to save the revolution, providing that in the process they killed as many enemies around them as possible. This was completely new, because the Quran specifically prohibited suicide. In the past, you became a martyr on the battlefield because God chose the time and place of your death. But Khomeini changed this. He did it by going back to one of the central rituals of Shia Islam. Every year, Shiites march in a procession, mourning the sacrifice of their founder, Hussein. As they do, they whip themselves, symbolically reenacting Hussein's suffering. Khomeini said that the ultimate act of penitence was not just to whip yourself, but to kill yourself, providing it was for the greater good of the revolution.
In the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful, good afternoon. An Iraqi Soviet-made MiG-23 was shot down by the Air Force jet fighters of the Islamic Republic over the northwestern Iranian border region of Marivan at 10:08 hours local time Saturday, said the Joint Staff Command's communique numbered 1710.
Khomeini had mobilized this force when the country was attacked by Iraq. Iran faced almost certain defeat because Iraq had far superior weapons, many of them supplied by America. So the revolutionaries took tens of thousands of young boys out of schools, put them on buses and sent them to the front line. Their job was to walk through the enemy's minefields, deliberately blowing themselves up in order to open gaps that would allow the Iranian army to pass through unharmed. It was organised suicide on a vast scale. This human sacrifice was commemorated in giant cemeteries across the country. Fountains flowing with blood-red water glorified this new kind of martyrdom. It was this new idea of an unstoppable human weapon that President Assad took from Khomeini and brought to the West for the first time. But as it travelled, it would mutate into something even more deadly. Instead of just killing yourself, you would take explosives with you into the heart of the enemy, and then blow yourself up, taking dozens or even hundreds along with you. It would become known as suicide bombing. In October 1983, 2 suicide bombers drove trucks into the US Marine barracks in Beirut.
It was seeing something move that took me out of my trance. And then I recognized, oh yes, Marines were in that building. A lot of Marines were in that building. And that's when I ran down and it was a black Marine. He looked white. The dust, it just covered him.
The massive explosions killed 241 Americans. The bombers were members of a new militant group that no one had heard of. They called themselves Hezbollah, and although many of them were Iranian, they were very much under the control of Syria and the Syrian intelligence agencies. President Assad was using them as his proxies to attack America.
Whoever carried out yesterday's bombings, Shia Muslim fanatics, devotees of the Ayatollah Khomeini, or whatever, it is Syria who profits politically. The most significant fact is that the dissidents live and work with Syrian protection. So it is to Syria, rather than to the dissident group's guiding light, Ayatollah Khomeini of Iran, that we must look for an explanation of the group's activities. Destabilization is Syria's Middle Eastern way of reminding the world that Syria must not be left out of plans for the future of the area.
There are no words that can express our sorrow and grief over the loss of those splendid young men and the injury to so many others. But these deeds make so evident the bestial nature of those who would assume power if they could have their way and drive us out of that area.
But despite his words, within 4 months, President Reagan withdrew all the American troops from the Lebanon. The Secretary of State, George Shultz, explained, "We became paralyzed by the complexity that we faced," he said. So the Americans turned and left. For President Assad, it was an extraordinary achievement. He was the only Arab leader to have defeated the Americans and forced them to leave the Middle East. He had done it by using the new force of suicide bombing. A force that, once unleashed, was going to spread with unstoppable power. But at this point, both Assad and the Iranians thought that they could control it. And what gave it this extraordinary power was that it held out the dream of transcending the corruptions of the world and entering a new and better realm.
one should defend the realm of Islam and Muslims against heretics and invaders. And to fulfill this duty, one should even sacrifice one's life. We believe that martyrs can overlook our deeds from the other world. It means that after death, the martyr lives and can still witness this world.
Faced with the humiliating defeat in the Lebanon, President Reagan's government was desperate to shore up the vision of a moral world where a good America struggled against evil. And to do this, they were going to create a simple villain, an imaginary enemy, one that would free them from the paralyzing complexity of real Middle Eastern politics. And the perfect candidate was waiting in the wings. Colonel Gaddafi, the ruler of Libya. The Americans were going to ruthlessly use Colonel Gaddafi to create a fake terrorist mastermind. And Gaddafi was going to happily play along, because it would turn him into a famous global figure. Colonel Gaddafi had taken power in a coup in the 1970s. But from the very start, he was convinced that he was more than just the leader of one country. He believed that he was an international revolutionary whose destiny was to challenge the power of the West.
Gentlemen, the Queen.
When he was a young officer, Gaddafi had been sent to England for training. And he had detested the patronising racism that he said he had found at the heart of British society.
Yes, I attended a course. I have been in England since 1966, from April to August.
You had the best months?
I was in Beaconsfield, a village called Beaconsfield, in Army School. In fact, we ill-treated in that place from some British officers. I think those officers were Jews, maybe Jews.
But ill-treated in what sort of way?
In many ways. They ill-treat us every time.
By being rude or by being bullying or?
In their all behavior towards us, they ill-treat us. They hate us anyhow because of colonization. It is a result of colonialism.
Once in power, Gaddafi had developed his own revolutionary theory, which he called the Third Universal Theory. It was an alternative, he said, to communism and capitalism. He published it in a green book, but practically no one read it. He had sent money and weapons to the IRA in Ireland to help them overthrow the British ruling class. But all the other Arab leaders rejected him and his ideas. They thought that he was mad. And by the mid-1980s, Gaddafi was an isolated figure, with no friends and no global influence. Then suddenly that changed. In December 1985, terrorists attacked Rome and Vienna airports simultaneously, killing 19 people, including 5 Americans. There was growing pressure on President Reagan to retaliate.
It's time to rename your State Department the Capitulation Department. Get off of your stick, Mr. President. The American people are sick and tired of being kicked around. You talk tough, Let's see you use some of these billions and billions and billions of dollars worth of weapons that you've asked us to approve. Your words are cheap talk.
President Reagan immediately announced that Colonel Gaddafi was definitely behind the attacks.
These murderers could not carry out their crimes without the sanctuary and support provided by regimes such as Colonel Gaddafi's in Libya. The Rome and Vienna murders are only the latest in a series of brutal terrorist acts committed with Gaddafi's backing.
But the European security services who investigated the attacks were convinced that Libya was not involved at all, and that the mastermind behind the attacks was in fact Syria, that the terrorists had been directed by the Syrian intelligence agencies.
But the Americans say that the attack at Rome airport was organized by Gaddafi, not by Damascus.
No,
what do you say?
We don't have any evidence.
You have no evidence
supporting such affirmation. The only evidence we have shows a Syrian connection.
Do you say that it was Libya, and the president said the evidence of Libya's culpability was irrefutable?
Yeah.
But the Italian authorities to whom I've spoken say emphatically on the record that their investigations have shown that it was entirely masterminded by Syria.
I don't agree with that at all.
Well, they've interrogated the surviving terrorists.
I must just say I don't agree with that.
But you've no evidence that Libya was in on the planning either.
Our evidence on Libya is circumstantial but very strong.
But why does the president then say it's irrefutable if you call it circumstantial?
Well, people can be convicted and sentenced in our courts on circumstantial evidence.
But what made it even more confusing was that although there seemed to be no evidence that Gaddafi had been behind the attacks, he made no attempt to deny the allegations. Instead, he went the other way and turned the crisis into a global drama.
It is not a time of saying it is a time of work, time of confrontation.
Threatening suicide attacks against America.
This hostile position cannot be explained in racist and crusade terms. Suicidal attacks will have to be an answer to a military attack. But Libya is not affected by such measures that Reagan has declared. Stinking, rotten crusader.
Gaddafi now started to play a role that was going to become very familiar. He grabbed the publicity that had been given to him by the Americans and used it dramatically. He promoted himself as an international revolutionary who would help to liberate oppressed peoples around the world, even the blacks in America. Gaddafi arranged for a live satellite link to a mass meeting of the Nation of Islam in Chicago.
Brothers and sisters, it is with great honor and privilege that I present to you the leader of the Al-Fatah revolution from Libya, our brother Muammar al-Gaddafi.
Gaddafi told them that Libya was now their ally in their struggle against white America.
And to express my full support and support of my country to your struggle for freedom, for emancipation.
Gaddafi promised that he would supply weapons to create a black army in America of 400,000 men. If white America refuses to accept blacks as US citizens, he told them, it must therefore be destroyed. Gaddafi also invited a group of German rocket scientists to come to Libya to build him a rocket. He insisted it had no military purpose. Libya was now going to explore outer space.
I think it is peaceful and civilian activity for investigation of space and something like this. And it has nothing to do with any military things.
But no one believed him. Journalists warned that Gaddafi was really preparing to attack Europe, vividly dramatizing the new danger.
That is something like this, which goes that way to put something into space. But the same device tilted, say, to an angle of 45 degrees could, of course, become something very different. a missile possibly carrying a warhead. That would put Libya within range of an enormous area. A chilling proposition with its range of 2,000 kilometers.
The Americans and Gaddafi now became locked together in a cycle of mutual reinforcement. In the process, a powerful new image was created that was going to capture the imagination of the West. Gaddafi became a global supervillain, at the head of what was called a rogue state, a madman who threatened the stability of the world. And Gaddafi was loving every minute of it.
Does he think in the past his decisions sometimes have been taken too quickly?
Maybe.
On world affairs?
Maybe.
I think sometimes that is what has made people in the world nervous of you, perhaps.
Maybe.
Then there was another terrorist attack at a discotheque in West Berlin. A bomb killed an American soldier and injured hundreds. The Americans released what they said were intercepts by the National Security Agency that proved that Colonel Gaddafi was behind the bombing, and a dossier that they said proved that he was also the mastermind behind a whole range of other attacks. President Reagan ordered the Pentagon to prepare to bomb Libya. But again, there were doubts, this time within the American government itself. There were concerns that analysts were being pressured to make a case that didn't really exist. And to do it, they were taking Gaddafi's rhetoric about himself as a global revolutionary and his manic ravings, and then representing them as fact. And in the process, together, the Americans and Gaddafi were constructing a fictional world.
The analyst was certainly, I'm convinced, pressured into developing a prima facie case against the Libyan government. From the somewhat incoherent ravings of a maniac, both interceptions of a clandestine nature and interceptions of a open radio broadcasts or whatever, as well as other sources, quotations of his, that one can assemble a neatly put together package demonstrating that the man had violent interests against the United States and its European allies.
The European intelligence agencies told the Americans that they were wrong, that it was Syria that was behind the bombing, not Libya. But the Americans had decided to attack Libya because they couldn't face the dangerous consequences of attacking Syria. Instead, they went for Gaddafi, a man without friends or allies.
Libya were less downside consequences, if you will. There's less Arab support for Gaddafi. We figured there would be less Soviet support for Gaddafi. There's no question but what Libya was more vulnerable than Syria and Iran.
It was a soft
and
target.
that is certainly an element, of course.
In April 1986, the Americans attacked Libya. Their targets included Colonel Gaddafi's own house. Immediately after the attack, Gaddafi appeared in the ruins to describe what had happened.
The family were asleep, and my wife was, that day, tied down to the bed because she had a slip disc. I tried to rescue the children, and the house started to collapse, as you can see, and the books started to burn. They concentrated on the children's room so that they would kill all the children. Our small adopted daughter was killed, and 2 of our children were injured.
But yet again, Gaddafi might have been lying. Ever since then, there have been rumours that his adopted daughter actually survived. But many other children were killed in the raid because the American bombing was so inaccurate. Gaddafi realised that the attention of the whole world was now focused on him. and he grabbed the moment to promote his own revolutionary theory, the Third Way, as a global alternative to democracy.
I feel that I'm really responsible for conveying the Third World Theory and the Green Book to the rising generation, to the young American and British people, so that we can rescue America and Britain and these generations of young people from this theory, this electoral party theory, which enabled an imbecile like Reagan to rule the mightiest power on earth and use it to destroy other people's homes, and enabled a harlot like Thatcher to rule a great nation like Britain.
President Assad didn't want stability. He wanted revenge. In December 1988, a bomb exploded on a Pan Am plane over Lockerbie in Scotland. Almost immediately, investigators and journalists pointed the finger at Syria. The bombing had been done, they said, in revenge for the Americans shooting down of an Iranian airliner in the Gulf a few months before. And for 18 months, everyone agreed that this was the truth. But then, a strange thing happened. The security agencies said that they had been wrong. It hadn't been Syria at all. It was Libya who had been behind the Lockerbie bombing. But many journalists and politicians did not believe it. They were convinced that the switch had happened for the most cynical of reasons. That America and Britain desperately needed Assad as an ally in the coming Gulf War against Saddam Hussein. So once again, they blamed Colonel Gaddafi as the terrorist mastermind.
Well, Syria, of course, was unfortunately accused of many terrorist outrage and of harbouring terrorist groups. It appears that we have now restored relations with them, as have the Americans. They're now our friends, although we get no real assurances on the past whatsoever. It strikes me as very strange indeed that many of the things we thought were previously the responsibility of Syria have now dramatically become the responsibility of Libya.
But Assad was not really in control, because he had released forces that no one would be able to control. The force that 10 years before he had brought from Iran to attack the West, the human bomb, was now about to jump, like a virus, from Shia to Sunni Islam. In December 1992, the militant group Hamas kidnapped an Israeli border guard and stabbed him to death. The Israeli response was overwhelming. They arrested 415 members of Hamas, put them on buses, and took them to the top of a bleak mountain in southern Lebanon. They left them there and refused to allow any humanitarian aid through. But the Israelis had dumped the Hamas militants in an area controlled by Hezbollah. They spent 6 months there, and during that time they learnt from Hezbollah how powerful suicide bombing could be. Hezbollah told them how they had used it to force the Israelis out of Beirut and back to the border. The first sign that the idea had spread to Hamas was when a group of the deportees marched in protest towards the Israeli border, dressed as martyrs, as the Israelis shelled them. But it soon became more than just theatre. Hamas began a wave of suicide attacks in Israel.
Just before 9, at the height of Tel Aviv's rush hour, the bomb ripped apart a commuter bus. An amateur cameraman recorded the scene in the moments afterwards as a dazed woman was helped out of the smouldering wreckage.
I didn't want to believe that under my house there is a bomb. And when I realized it's a bomb, I started to cry because it was the first time I saw it in Tel Aviv.
Hamas sent the bombers into the heart of Israeli cities to blow themselves up. and kill as many around them as possible. In doing this, Hamas were going much further than Hezbollah ever had. They were targeting civilians, something Hezbollah had never done. The tactic shocked the Sunni world. This was something completely alien to its history. Not only did the Quran forbid suicide, but Sunni Islam did not have any rituals of self-sacrifice, unlike the Shias. The most senior religious leader in Saudi Arabia insisted it was wrong. But a mainstream theologian from Egypt, called Sheikh Qaradawi, seized the moment. He issued a fatwa that justified the attacks. And, he added, it was also justified to kill civilians. Because in Israel, everyone, including women, serve as reservists. So really, they are all part of the enemy army.
It's not suicide. It is martyrdom in the name of God. Islamic theologians and jurisprudents have debated this issue. Israeli women are not like women in our society because Israeli women are militarized. Secondly, I consider this type of martyrdom operation as an indication of justice of Allah Almighty. Allah is just. Through His infinite wisdom, He has given the weak what the strong do not possess, and that is the ability to turn their bodies into bombs like the Palestinians do.
Hamas kept sending the bombers into Israel, sometimes day after day. The horror overwhelmed Israeli society, and it completely destroyed the ability of politics to solve the Palestinian crisis. Instead, in the Israeli election of 1996, Benjamin Netanyahu took power. He turned against the peace process, which was exactly what Hamas wanted. And from then on, the two sides became locked together in ever more horrific cycles of violence. The human bomb had destroyed the very thing that President Assad had first wanted, a real political solution to the Palestinian question.
It was just after 1 o'clock and the market was full of shoppers. Streams of ambulances came to carry away the dead and the injured. It was a place of appalling suffering, but even with the first grief came the immediate political impact on the peace process.
It's impossible. This moment it will be the end, must be the end of this bloody peace process.
The attacks in September 2001 were suicide bombs, but now on a huge scale. They demonstrated the terrifying power of this new force to penetrate all defences. They had come to kill thousands of Americans on their own soil. "20 years before, President Reagan had been confronted by the first suicide bombers. They had been unleashed by President Assad of Syria to force America out of the Middle East. But rather than confront the complexity of Syria and Israel and the Palestinian problem, America had retreated and left Syria and suicide bombing to fester and mutate. They had gone instead for Colonel Gaddafi and turned him into an evil global terrorist. But in the process, this changed the way people saw and understood terrorism. Instead of a violence born out of political struggles for power, it became replaced by a much simpler image of an evil tyrant at the head of a rogue state, who became more like an arch criminal who wanted to terrorize the world. All the politics and power dropped away. The problem was just them and their evil personalities. And after 9/11, this led to a new and equally simple idea: that if only you could remove these tyrannical figures, then the grateful people of their country would transform naturally into a democracy, because they would be free of the evil.
We owe it to the future of civilization not to allow the world's worst leaders to develop and deploy and therefore blackmail freed-loving countries with the world's worst weapons.
We know they've already got chemical and biological weapons there. We know that they're certainly doing their best to acquire nuclear weapons technology. If we allow them to do that and do nothing about it, then I think later generations will consider us deeply irresponsible.
Both Tony Blair and George Bush became possessed by the idea of ridding the world of Saddam Hussein. So possessed that they believed any story that proved his evil intentions. And the line between reality and fiction became ever more blurred. In September 2002, the head of MI6 rushed to Downing Street to tell Blair excitedly that they had finally found the source that confirmed everything. The source, he said, had direct access to Saddam Hussein's chemical weapons program, which was making vast quantities of VX and sarin nerve agents. The nerve agents were being loaded into linked hollow glass spheres. But then someone in MI6 noticed that the detail the source was describing was identical to scenes in the 1996 movie The Rock, starring Sean Connery and Nicolas Cage.
Really elegant string of pearls configuration. Unfortunately, incredibly unstable.
Well, what exactly does this stuff do?
If the rocket renders it aerosol, it can take out the entire city of people.
How?
It's a cholinesterase inhibitor. Stops the brain from sending nerve messages down the spinal cord.
A later report into the Iraq War pointed out glass containers were not typically used in chemical munitions.
Seizes your nervous system. Do not move that!
And the informant had obviously seen a popular movie known as The Rock that had inaccurately depicted nerve agents being carried in glass beads or spheres.
After your skin melts off.
Oh my God.
That there is a threat from Saddam Hussein and the weapons of mass destruction that he has acquired is not in doubt at all.
Hafez al-Assad had died in 2000. His son Bashar became the new president of Syria. But he couldn't escape the inexorable logic of what his father had started. 20 years before, his father had sent Shiite suicide bombers to attack the Americans in Lebanon. Now, as America and Britain invaded Iraq, Bashar decided that he would copy his father. But what he was about to let loose would tear the Arab world apart and then come back to try to destroy him. Bashar Assad was never supposed to have been president. It was always going to have been his elder brother, Basil. But then Basil had died in a car crash. So now, Bashar took over the giant palace that his father had built above Damascus. Up to this point, Bashar had not been interested in politics. He was fascinated by computers. He founded the Syrian Computer Society and brought the internet to the country. His favourite band was the Electric Light Orchestra. But now he was president. And he set out to attack America. Bashar Assad was convinced that the invasion of Iraq was just the first step of a plot by the Western powers to take over the whole of the Middle East. He knew that the invasion had outraged many of the radical Islamists in Syria, and what they most wanted to do was to go to Iraq and kill Americans. So Bashar instructed the Syrian intelligence services to help them do this. Syrian agents set up a pipeline that began to feed thousands of militants across the border and into the heart of the insurgency. And it grew. Within a year, almost all the foreign fighters from across the world were coming through Syria. And they brought suicide bombing with them. The Americans estimated that 90% of the suicide bombers in Iraq were foreign fighters. But it began to run out of control. Most of the jihadists had joined the group Al-Qaeda in Iraq, that then turned to killing Shiites in an attempt to create a civil war. And the force that had originally been invented by the Shiites, suicide bombing, now returned and started to kill them.
Then this. A moment of silence before people realised what was happening.
A few seconds ago, we just had repeated explosions in the street below me. People are now fleeing in terror from the central square around the mosque. This is what everybody feared. We just heard another explosion in the distance, that somebody would try to target this religious festival to try to bring about a sectarian conflict in Iraq.
There was panic, a terrified stampede. But some of these people were running into the next bombs. We counted at least 6 separate explosions.
Tony Blair and George Bush were faced by disaster. Iraq was imploding, while at home they were being accused of lying to their own people to justify the invasion. What they desperately needed was something that would show that the invasion was having a good effect in the Arab world. So they made an extraordinary decision. They turned for help to the man who they had always insisted was one of the world's most dangerous tyrants, Colonel Gaddafi. And instead, they set out to make him their new best friend. It was going to be the highest achievement of perception management. A man who had been created by the West as a fake global supervillain was now going to be turned into a fake hero of democracy. And everyone, not just politicians, would become involved. Public relations, academics, television presenters, spies, and even musicians were all going to help reinvent Colonel Gaddafi. It would show just how many people in the Western establishment had by now become the engineers of this fake world. Ever since he had been accused of the Lockerbie bombing, Colonel Gaddafi had been a complete outcast. The West had imposed sanctions on Libya, and the economy was falling apart. But then suddenly, Tony Blair broke live into the BBC Evening News.
The Prime Minister, Tony Blair, is about to make a statement the BBC understands from Downing Street. It's of international significance. He'll be making his statement at any moment. Now we can see pictures of him in Durham City. Here he is.
Colonel Gaddafi has confirmed that Libya has in the past sought to develop weapons of mass destruction capabilities. Libya has now declared its intention to dismantle its weapons of mass destruction completely. This decision by Colonel Gaddafi is an historic one and a courageous one, and I applaud it.
Today in Tripoli, the leader of Libya, Colonel Muammar al-Gaddafi, publicly confirmed his commitment to disclose and dismantle all weapons of mass destruction programs in his country.
Colonel Gaddafi now became for Western politicians a heroic figure. His decision to give up his weapons of mass destruction seemed to prove that the invasion of Iraq could transform the Middle East. And Tony Blair travelled to meet Gaddafi in his desert tent, to welcome him back into what one journalist called the community of civilized nations. But as in the past, nothing was what it seemed with Colonel Gaddafi. In reality, Gaddafi did not really have the terrifying weapons of mass destruction that he was promising to destroy. His nuclear program had stuttered to a halt long ago and never produced anything dangerous. He had managed to buy some equipment on the black market, but his technicians had been unable to assemble it. His biological weapons were non-existent. All he had was some old mustard gas in leaking barrels. But now, he had to pretend to have a terrifying arsenal of weapons, and the West had to pretend that they had avoided another global threat. And then the made-up stories became even more complicated. As part of the deal, the West said that if Gaddafi admitted that Libya had done the Lockerbie bombing, then they would lift the sanctions. But many of those who had investigated Lockerbie were still convinced that Libya hadn't done it, that really it had been Syria. But Colonel Gaddafi confessed. His son Saif was interviewed about this confession. He said that his father was simply pretending that he had been behind the Lockerbie bombing to get the sanctions lifted, that new lies were being built on top of old lies to construct a completely make-believe world.
You have to accept, or you had to accept at that time, the responsibility, because you have to accept responsibilities, you have to pay compensation in order to get rid of the sanction. It means we did that not because we are convinced that we did it, but because to find an exit out of this nightmare.
So what you're saying is that you accept responsibility, but you're not admitting that you did it?
Yes.
And this is all a sham, you're saying, just to get sanctions over with so that you can start normal diplomatic relations with the West?
Okay. What's wrong with that?
It's a very cynical way to behave as a country, isn't it? Many people would say.
First of all, I mean, the Americans in the British, they told us to write that letter. They told us to pay compensation. And then they opened their embassies and they restored the relation and they came to us. It was their game, not our game.
That's great, thank you. Does the leader know there's a picture on the television, or you didn't tell him? Oh, good, thank you.
Public relations companies then came to Libya to do what they called reframing the narrative. One firm was paid $3 million to turn Gaddafi into what they described as a modern world thinker.
Is that going to be there or not?
Okay. We're going in 10.
They did this by bringing other famous world thinkers, and TV presenters out to Libya to meet the colonel and discuss his theories.
Hello and welcome to Libya in the Global Age, a conversation with Muammar Gaddafi. But first, let's get the story so far of Libya.
One world thinker was called Lord Anthony Giddens. Coincidentally, he had a theory which he called the Third Way, which had inspired Tony Blair. Colonel Gaddafi's own theory was called the Third Universal Theory. Lord Giddens later wrote about his talks with the Libyan leader. Colonel Gaddafi likes my term the Third Way because his own political philosophy is a version of this idea. He makes many intelligent and perceptive points. I leave enlivened and encouraged.
After 40 years, the leader of Libya, Muammar Gaddafi.
And then Colonel Gaddafi achieved his lifelong dream. He was invited to address the United Nations. He spent almost 2 hours explaining his Third Universal Theory, and also demanded an investigation into the shootings of President Kennedy and Martin Luther King. When he was in New York, Gaddafi was offered a tent, just like the one he had at home, in the gardens of a grand mansion. The man who made the offer was Donald Trump.
I mean, I've dealt with everybody. And by the way, I could tell you something else. What? I dealt with Gaddafi. What did I do with Gaddafi?
You buried the lead. What'd you do?
Yeah. Excuse me. I rented him a piece of land. He paid me more for one night than the land was worth for the whole year or for 2 years. And then I didn't let him use the land. That's what we should be doing.
Was that over in New Jersey?
I don't want to use the word screw, but I screwed him. That's what we should be doing.
Our main street. Looks like chaos. Looks like police is running around and a few hundred people walking down the street.
Then, almost immediately, the Arab Spring began. The first revolution started in Tunisia, but it quickly spread to Egypt. On January the 25th, 2011, thousands of Egyptians came out in groups across Cairo and then started moving towards Tahrir Square. It seemed like a spontaneous uprising, but the internet had played a key role in organising the groups. One of the main activists was an Egyptian computer engineer called Wael Ghonim. He worked for Google in Egypt, but he had also set up the Facebook site that played the key role in organising the first protests. As hundreds of thousands took over Tahrir Square, Ghonim gave an interview on Egyptian TV.
ما كانوش مصدقين يعني ايه شويه شباب انا كنت بسميهم على الصفحه زمان عيال الفيسبوك. هم كانوا بيسمونا زمان ايام وقفات خالد سعيد في اول ما طلعنا خالص شويه العيال اللي على الفيسبوك اللي بيعملوا شويه دوشه مش مصدقين ان الشباب دول نزلوا بعشرات الالاف يوم ال 25. فارجوكم يا جماعه مفيش ابطال، الابطال هم الناس اللي في الشارع، الابطال هو كل واحد فينا، مفيش النهارده واحد راكب الحصان هو اللي بيضرب السرج ويحرك الناس، اوعى حد يضحك عليكم ويقول لكم كده. دي ثورة شباب الانترنت، دي ثورة شباب الانترنت اللي بقت بعد كده ثورة شباب مصر، اللي بعد كده بقت ثورة كل مصر.
But Ghonim was also overwhelmed by the power this new technology had. That a computer engineer with a keyboard could call out thousands of people, some of whom then died in the midst of the protests.
أنا عايز أقول لكل أم وكل أب بجد فقد ابنه. أنا آسف بس دي مش غلطتنا. والله العظيم غلطتنا. دي غلطة كل واحد كان ماسك في السلطة ومثبت فيها. عايز أمشي.
Many liberals in the West saw this as proof of the revolutionary power of the internet. Again, it seemed to be able to organise a revolution without leaders. A revolution powerful enough to topple a brutal dictator who had been backed by America and the West for 30 years. But the internet radicals were not the only ones who saw their dreams being fulfilled in the Arab Spring. Many of the political leaders of the West also enthusiastically supported the revolutions because it seemed to fit with their simple idea of regime change. It might have failed in Iraq, but now the people everywhere were rising up to rid themselves of the evil tyrants, and democracy would flourish. So when an uprising began in Libya, Britain, France and America supported it. And suddenly, Colonel Gaddafi stopped being a hero of the West. All the politicians and the public relations people and the academics who had all promoted him as a global thinker suddenly disappeared. And Gaddafi became yet again an evil dictator who had to be overthrown. His son Saif said, "The way these people are disowning me and my father is disgusting. Just a few months ago, we were being treated as honoured friends. Now that rebels are threatening our country, these cowards are turning on us." Colonel Gaddafi retreated to the ruins of the house that the Americans had bombed 30 years before and addressed the world.
Those who love Muammar Gaddafi is the glory. If I had a position, if I were a president, I would have resigned. I would have thrown my resignation in your face. But I have no position, no post. I have nowhere to resign from. I have my gun. I have my rifle to fight for Libya. Withdraw your children from the streets. Take your children back. They are dragging your children, they're making your children drunk, and they're sending them to hell. Your children will die. What for?
In November 2011, a large convoy was spotted driving at high speed away from Colonel Gaddafi's hometown of Sirte. An American drone, controlled from a shed outside Las Vegas, was sent to follow it. The operator fired a missile at the lead car of the convoy. Gaddafi then fled, looking for shelter from the oncoming rebel forces. He hid under the road in a drainage pipe. But instead of becoming a democracy, Libya began to descend into chaos. And the other revolutions were also failing. The Occupy camps had become trapped in endless meetings, and it became clear that there was a terrible confusion at the heart of the movement. The radicals had believed that if they could create a new way of organising people, then a new society would emerge. But what they did not have was a picture of what that society would be like, a vision of the future. The truth was that their revolution was not about an idea. It was about how you manage things. And those who had started the revolution in Egypt came face to face with the same terrible fact. Social media had helped to bring people together in Tahrir Square. But once there, the internet gave no clue as to what kind of new society they could create in Egypt. The movement stalled. And a group that did have a powerful idea, the Muslim Brotherhood, rushed in to fill the vacuum. The Brotherhood took power in an election, and one of them, Mohamed Morsi, became president. The liberals and the left were shocked, and bit by bit they turned back to the military, protesting, asking them to save the revolution from being captured by Islamists. In the spring of 2013, the military took action. They arrested the president and killed hundreds of his supporters who protested. And an extraordinary spectacle unfolded in Tahrir Square. Thousands of the liberal activists who had begun the revolution 2 years before, summoned by social media, now welcomed the military back by waving their laser pens at the helicopters flying overhead. The crowd had been summoned there, once again, by Facebook.
The attack happened here at a central police station in Damascus. Police say the bomber came up the stairs. Police then opened fire, and then police say he detonated the explosives. And the damage is here to see. Behind me, the pockmarked walls where the ball bearings hit. Blood splattered on the walls. And the force of the blast caused walls to collapse. And everything is topsy-turvy, everything destroyed.
By now, Syria was being torn apart by a horrific civil war. What had started as part of the Arab Spring had turned into a vicious battle to the death between Bashar al-Assad and his opponents. And at the heart of the conflict was the force that his father had first brought to the West, suicide bombing. Back in the 1980s, Bashar Assad's father had seen suicide bombing as a weapon he could use to force the Americans out of the Middle East. But over the next 30 years, it had shifted and mutated into something that had now ended up doing the very opposite, tearing the Arab world apart. Hafez al-Assad's dream of a powerful and united Arab world was now destroyed. In Iraq, extremist Sunni groups had used suicide bombing as a way to start a sectarian war. And now, groups like ISIS brought the same techniques into Syria to attack not just Assad's son, but his fellow Shiites. And like his father, Bashar Assad retaliated with a vengeful fury, and the country fell apart.
Allahu Akbar. Allahu Akbar. Allahu Akbar.
My fellow Americans, tonight I want to talk to you about Syria, why it matters, and where we go from here.
Faced by the war, Western politicians were bewildered. They insisted that Bashar Assad was evil. But then it turned out that his enemies were more evil and more horrific than him.
The question before the House today is how we keep the British people safe from the threat posed by ISIL. This is not about whether we want to fight terrorism, it's about how best we do that.
So Britain, America and France decided to bomb the terrorist threat. But the effect of that was to help keep Assad in power. Then it became more confusing. Suddenly, the Russians intervened. President Putin sent hundreds of planes and combat troops to support Assad. But no one knew what their underlying aim was. They seemed to be using a strategy that Vladislav Surkov had developed in the Ukraine. He called it non-linear warfare. It was a new kind of war, where you never know what the enemy are really up to.
Allahu Akbar.
The underlying aim, Surkov said, was not to win the war, but to use the conflict to create a constant state of destabilized perception in order to manage and control.
Allahu Akbar.
In March 2016, the Russians suddenly announced with a great fanfare that they were leaving Syria. And a concert was held in the ruins of Palmyra to celebrate the withdrawal. But in reality, the Russians never left. They are still there, and still no one knows what they really want.
كانت الأمور أسهل ما كنا نتصور رغم أن هذا المكان كان له أهمية